In this video, I'm going to review the Writers of the Future Anthology, Volume 42. Stick around to hear what I thought of the stories and learn if it's worth your time to read. L. Ron Hubbard started the Writers of the Future contest in 1983 to help open the door for unpublished writers, and it's helped a lot start their careers. There are quarterly judging cycles in the contest, and writers from all over the world enter the contest. It's free to enter, and the prize package for winning includes a trip to a week-long workshop and an awards ceremony. Each year's winners are published in the annual anthology, and having that accolade on a query letter impacts a writer's ability to get other stories moved up in a slush pile at other publishers and magazines. Here's my full disclosure moment. The publisher, Galaxy Press, was kind enough to offer me an advanced reader's copy, or ARC, of Volume 42 for an honest review of the stories. Remember that these are just my opinions of the stories, and your mileage may vary. One last thing, to any of the authors out there that I'm reviewing, my apologies if I butcher your name. The first story is by Thomas K. Slee, who lives in Australia. The title is a long one. It's called Form 14B, Application for Certification of Consciousness Transfer Post-Mortem. The protagonist is a famous internet personality named Cameron Manna, and his online personality is called Caveman. Caveman recently died on a cave diving expedition, and his consciousness was uploaded into a device enabling a transfer into a new body. Now he and his lawyer Roy are at a government office trying to get approval for that transfer, but they've run into a bit of a snag. The story is told in two parts. One part has Cameron and Roy trying to deal with the paperwork drill and the bureaucrats that handle that paperwork. The other part is told as descriptions of the videos that Caveman was making when he died. They serve as a unique way to provide a flashback and fill in the backstory. I don't recall seeing anything like this before, and I thought it was kind of a cool way to do it. Even though Cameron is a personality in an electronic box at this point, his personality comes through clearly in present time and in the video flashback sequences. I really enjoyed this story, and I'd rate it a 7 out of 10. It pokes a little fun at government bureaucracy and bureaucrats. The difficulties that Cameron and Roy had to deal with pulled me along and made me want to keep reading. The action rose at the right pace, and the big conflict is revealed kind of at the halfway point. All around, it's a strong story and a good opening to the 42nd Writers of the Future anthology. The next story is called Saffron and Marigolds and was written by Kathleen Powell, who entered the contest a lot of times before winning. So props to her for sticking with it. The story is about a baker named Arthur who was supposed to be kidnapped by a changeling named Manura because someone named the Green King wanted him. However, Manura refused and was banished, but before she left, she had to introduce Arthur to a dragon named Wantley, who is basically trapped in a cave that he's too big to escape. For me, the story was just kind of okay. There are some interesting observations about the relationship between Manura and Arthur, and the interactions between Arthur and Wantley the dragon are kind of cute. I'd rate this one a 5 out of 10. It was written well enough, but there was a lot of build-up space for the resolution, which wasn't very intense for me. It's possible some of this is my bias against stories that have fairies in them, but the focus is more on Arthur and his efforts to free Wantley, so I don't think that really influenced my rating that much. The third story is by California Bay Area resident Alina Kumra, and it's titled Bloom Decay. The world in this story has a corporation named Renaissance that monitors everything people do and uses AI to identify when people are acting in an unusual way. The tech examines everything from minor changes in facial expression to perspiration rate and blood pressure. Then it uses this and a specific law to suppress people's creativity. Theodore Newark is a narrative architect responsible for finding talent and developing it in such a way that it doesn't break the content rules that have been set up. He finds an artist named Wenqian Zhang, or aka Elliot, and starts working with her to develop and present her content to viewers. Elliot needs the money to help her ill mother, Dr. Wen Li Zhang, so it's a mutually beneficial relationship, but there's something else going on here, which is pretty interesting. I think the biggest theme in this story is oppression. How would you feel if you were watched every second of every day, all your expressions and physiological responses constantly analyzed? What if you couldn't meet and have a private conversation unless you found a dead spot in the surveillance cameras? What if a writer's language was forced to conform to specific allowable framing? There are some parallels to Orwell's 1984 here, but the setting in Bloom Decay isn't as overtly oppressive as 1984's setting. I'm rating this one an 8 out of 10. Like a lot of science fiction, this story starts off a little confusing, and it takes a few pages to set up scenes before the reader understands the setting. Once all that clicked together, though, I started really enjoying this story, and it got better with each page. There are some parallels here with the current social media environment and the 24-hour news cycle that our world is dealing with today. The title didn't make sense to me as I was reading the story, but once I'd finished it, I realized the connection, and I thought it was an excellent title for the concept. The next two pieces in the book are by L. Ron Hubbard, so they aren't by contest winners. The first is an essay called Artistic Presentation, which basically boils down to Hubbard's advice that artists have to take the effective way to make the best art, even if that isn't the easiest way. That essay is followed by Hubbard's story Space Can, which was originally published in the July 1942 issue of Astounding Science Fiction magazine. The story's a military science fiction story about a United States Navy ship taking on two ships of the Saturnian Alliance that have attacked a supply convoy out in space. The story jumps right into the action and has a fast pace. There isn't a great deal of character depth here, but I wouldn't expect that from a story published in the 1940s. I'm not sure, but I don't think deep characters were that common in science fiction written during that time period. I'd rate Space Can a 4 out of 10 with the caveat that it's pretty much a product of its time, so it might be worth it to older readers looking for a nostalgia trip or those interested in Golden Age science fiction. The next story is Shell Game by contest entrant Zach Poulter from the United States. This story is about a detective named John Roychik that's new to his unit. When he's out with his new partner Marco for the first time, they go to investigate a tip, and before he knows it, Roychik is in a room with dead bodies and he's holding the murder weapon. Someone hijacked his body to do the crime, and now he has to figure out who. It sounds like many other mysteries where the main character is somehow being framed for someone's death. What I found cool about this story is that the setting is a bit confusing at first, and that, along with the crime and mystery aspect of it, really pulled me in because I wanted to figure out both. I'm okay with a little confusion while the author builds the world up around the story, as long as it eventually becomes clear and the payoff is a good one. I'd rate this story a 9 out of 10. I liked the main character, and the way he approached the entire situation was reminiscent of noir fiction, focusing on the facts of the story and the different angles that different people might have. The action in the story eventually explains the way the world works, and a much clearer picture is set about halfway through. It's the second longest story in the anthology, but it's worth some patience, even if you too are confused by the beginning. The payoff was excellent, and I would give you more about it, but that would destroy the process of discovery that you yourself might go through with this tale. It's a good story. The next story is by Brenda Posey from Alabama, and it's called Canary. This story focuses on a woman named Reverie Pearson, who spent 30 years doing accounting work. Now she's earned a retirement and some well-liked solitude, and she finds that in a small basic cabin on 400 acres of land that her family owns. Unfortunately, the alone time she'd planned on having for the rest of her life gets interrupted by a lost 10-year-old boy that seems really dense. Of course, there's a lot more going on than she realizes. I can sympathize with Reverie here. She worked around people long enough that she's happy to be away from them unless she chooses to interact. She's tired of people, so she's angry that her natural surroundings and the quiet time they provide are being disturbed by what she assumes is some lost city brat who has irresponsible parents. It's not always easy to see if Reverie is more upset with the parents or the kid, who seems to lack any understanding of anything that she says until she repeats herself or shows him what she's talking about. At the same time, she has a heart and doesn't want the kid to starve or not get reunited with his parents, so she feels obligated to help. I did get a little tired of Reverie's apparent unwillingness to dig deeper into why the kid seemed so strange. With that said, I'd rate the story a 6 out of 10. The setting is described with just enough detail to be imagined without going overboard on description, which was really good. Even though it's a slow burn, the prose is pretty good and the character's irritation comes across pretty well in her dialogue and actions. Once the big reveal happens and Reverie figures out what's really going on, her motivation stays consistent with the rest of the story, which made sense considering her background. The next contestant story is called The Triceratops Effect, and it was written by Liverpool, UK resident Sean Stevenson, who uses S.J. Stevenson as his pen name. In this story, the asteroid that was supposed to have killed the dinosaurs is not showing up as expected. The main character leads a team of time travelers that are working on the problem. Their job is to dig a hole where the Chicxulub crater would be and set off nukes to start the extinction event. The problem is that they're behind schedule and the main character's boss is on his back about it. There's also a Triceratops called Gary that's kind of sad because he's all alone. Kind of feel bad for Gary. I found this story pretty entertaining. The characters in the digging team are given just enough time to make them seem like a real team. All the dialogue between the characters came across pretty naturally. I thought the setting could have used a little bit more description for the surrounding jungle. And I say jungle because the Chicxulub crater is in the Yucatan Peninsula, which is pretty much all jungle back then. I'd rate this story a 7 out of 10. I didn't completely buy the solution to them being behind schedule, but maybe it would work for me if I put a little more thought into it. I just don't know. I also liked the final interaction between the boss and the main character and how the main character helped out Gary the Triceratops. The next piece in the book is a 4-page essay about collaboration written by Larry Niven. He lays out 17 rules about collaborating with other writers while developing, writing, and editing a story. If you're interested in the collaboration process or want to know what writers consider before working together, it's worth a read. If you bought the book for the stories, you can probably skip the essay. Following Niven's essay is a story by Writers of the Future judge Orson Scott Card, who is well known as the author of Ender's Game and many other books. He wrote the story based on the cover painting for this volume, which is by an Argentine artist who lives in Spain, Ciruelo Cabral. Galaxy Press asked me not to reveal the story art for the contestant stories until after the reveal party, where the winners see their story's art for the first time. I'll do a separate video for the art for each story after that, but since this is the cover and it's already public knowledge, here's what it looks like. The story written for this is called Skinny Shins, and it follows a pair of scientists named Sigmund and Roe, or called Sigmund and Roe. The story starts by talking about their works scanning Antarctica, then gets into a discussion about a book that one of them kind of believes, but the other thinks is a crackpot theory. The book basically claims that there's a 300 million year old civilization at the bottom of the water in Antarctica. Sigmund convinces Roe to use their scanning satellites to try to see if there is any validity to the book, and then months later, they've given up analyzing their data because they're not finding anything. But then the aliens show up. Based on that brief bit, you're probably wondering how that leads to this image. It gets there, but it takes most of the story to do it. I'd rate this a 5 out of 10. Like most of Card's stories, it's well written and has believable characters and good dialogue. The story is mostly conversation based with little to no action. The strength of the story is in some of that dialogue and various thought paths that Sigmund and Roe take. It was somewhat entertaining, but it was a long haul. The payoff at the end was good for the story, but I knew well before I got there that I probably wasn't going to like it much, and I really didn't like the ending that much. Your mileage on this may vary, especially if you're a fan of Orson Scott Card. The next story is called A Ready-Made Bubble of Light by Thomas R. Eggenberger from Ohio in the United States. This is a world where time stops in small bubbles, and mankind has figured out how to enter those bubbles and save people from accidents or natural disasters. One team that does this work is led by a guy named Seb. In the beginning of the story, the team works to save 4 people from a car accident that's about to happen. They do everything as right as they can, as far as they can tell, and things just don't turn out the way they hoped. Later, Seb discovers that what happened may have been planned by someone else. The story starts off really confusing as it describes the interactions between the team members, the steps they take to rescue the people, and a little bit about how the timeout and time-in bubbles work. I was still really confused by the end of the scene, but the overall mechanics of their job didn't really take over the rest of the story. This was a good thing because I was worried that I was going to have to reread the first 13 pages to understand the rest, which I didn't want to do after reading it the first time. It was just that confusing to me. The concept as it developed in my mind was interesting, but I really didn't like the first part of the story that much. After that initial setup, the story didn't have any action in it, really. It was all dialogue and scenery from that point forward. However, it did become much more interesting as Seb worked with others to figure out what had happened at the crash site. One scene of the story was interesting and equated one of today's scientific challenges with what was happening with the time in and time out bubbles in the story. I found this to be the best part of the story, and it was all exposition via dialogue. As much as I liked the scientific explanation I just mentioned, I'd rate this story a 5 out of 10. The characters were developed to have individual personalities, so it was usually easy to understand who was speaking, whether there was a dialogue tag or not. For me, the beginning weakened the story quite a bit, and a shorter opening would have served it better, I thought. One thing that just felt like unnecessary filler was one character's whining about her desire to have more responsibility on the team. It just never went anywhere. If the story had been a little bit shorter, I probably would have rated it a 6, but I thought it was too long for the way it ended, so it ended up getting a 5 from me. Dorothy de Cook lives in South Africa and wrote the next story, which is called Thickly. In this story, there's a drug called Thickly that's supposed to enhance a woman's beauty and help her reach her womanly potential. The drug isn't too expensive, and a lot of people are using it, including the main character, Namza. One day on the bus to work, another girl that Namza knows has a severe reaction to the drug, and everyone is a little freaked out by it. However, the Thickly user becomes more impressive after the severe reaction. Namza struggles with how willing she is to rush a similar result. This story is really interesting as it explores what someone will do, what danger they'll risk for a shortcut to make themselves a more impressive person. Is the danger worth it? What happens to your current self when the shortcut takes effect? Will anyone even remember the old you from before? What if the shortcut has negative effects on the new, more impressive you? All these questions are touched on as the story progresses. Another thing it touches on is addiction. Can you resist when your body is pushing you to take more, even though you know you shouldn't? Do you hide the drug from yourself? Do you get rid of the drug? What do you do? This story gets a 7 out of 10 from me. The events in the story clearly demonstrate the problem Namza sees with the drug, even as she struggles to stop herself from trying to improve too quickly by taking more of it. The next story is called Ghost Dog, and it's by Mark McWaters. The story stars a guy named Mike and his little terrier named Bentley. One night, while trying to go to sleep, they get a disturbing visit from a large black animal with glowing red eyes, and the thing keeps coming back. I enjoyed this story because Mike actually acted somewhat intelligent about everything that was happening. Even when he was being stupid, his internal monologue was telling him that he was wrong. When trying to tell the entity to go away doesn't work, he does some research, and when that does nothing for him, he seeks help elsewhere, which is the smart thing to do. I'm rating this one a 7 out of 10. The beginning of the story is kind of tense, and the entity visitations later maintain that tension, but the story doesn't completely venture into the realm of horror, even though I wouldn't have minded if it had. It's an entertaining story that takes itself seriously when it needs to, yet doesn't hold that tension in every word. If you're a dog person, the ending will definitely pull at your heartstrings. The next piece in the book is an article by Brian C. Hales called The Creator's Journey. It basically outlines his journey into the art world and lays out some things that aspiring artists should be ready for while developing their art and their careers. It's worth a read for artists, but if you don't have any interest in an art career, you could probably skip it. The next story is by a former winner who has built a career from the time that she appeared in Writers of the Future Volume 1. Nina Kiriki Hoffman wrote Dragon Visits based on the illustration that accompanies the story. Martin is a boy that plays violin and apparently does it fairly well. On his 13th birthday, his mother is hit and killed by a drunk driver. Martin's dad has to deal with the aftermath and takes Martin to his grandmother's house where he starts to see dragons. I'm rating it a 7 out of 10. It's about loss and how people deal with it in different ways. Like Martin's dad deals with it one way that makes him seem kind of like a crappy dad, although I'm not really sure that's what's intended. Martin's grandmother doesn't show her emotions, though the depth of her relationship with Martin's mom isn't really explored much, except for one memory that Martin thinks about during the story. Martin's grief is shown through his thoughts and actions, which get the emotion across pretty well. I would also say the story is a really good length. The next story is by engineer and writer Michael T. Quester, or maybe Quester, from Cincinnati, Ohio, in the United States. The title is In Living Color. In this story, some people in the world have talents that allow them to do things others can't. August Stefanik is a talent who can hear the surface thoughts of people. He can also enter a picture and actually feel some of the emotion that happened there as long as it hasn't been too long since the picture was taken. Picture diving and thought hearing make him a valuable asset to the police department, and they've got a serial killer on their hands and they've turned to August for help. This story is cursed. It's a thriller with a science fiction aspect, and it pulls it off really well. The interactions between August and Shayna Warner, the detective that he's working with, are done well and come across naturally. After the first two scenes, I was engrossed in this story and wanted to find out what was going to happen as quickly as possible. And that's the curse I'm talking about. The story is just over too soon when it's this good. I'd rate this one a 10 out of 10. For me, it was the best story in the anthology, and it does a great job of giving August perspective on what life is like as a talent. His experience hearing other people's thoughts is doled out in small doses throughout the story. Warner's increasing desperation to find the killer isn't harped on too much, but August empathizes with her, so you know that it's there, and it adds a little extra tension to it. The climax has a great dread-filled, edge-of-your-seat feeling to it, and I have to say that I hope this one wins the grand prize at the Writers of the Future Awards ceremony. The next story comes to us from Denver, Colorado resident Mike Strickland. The title is As Long as You Both Shall Live. Sam Petrie is a test subject in an experiment. His mind is put into a virtual world while his body is commanded to do other things. Sometimes those things are safe, other times they're dangerous. Sam is falling for a woman named Kumiko, who is also involved in the experiment. Unfortunately, the danger becomes all too real one day. There's a love story that has a few hurdles to overcome at the heart of this story. Sam's feelings for Kumiko deepen every time he sees her, but the company running the experiment tries to keep them from seeing each other. The story is basically asking a question. What rights does someone have while their consciousness is in virtual reality? What happens if they get stuck there? Is it that company's sole decision, or do Sam and Kumiko have any agency over themselves? I'd rate this story a 6 out of 10. The technology's effect on the lives of the people involved with it is done pretty well, even though the viewpoint was limited to Sam. It was a decent read, and the implications of the technology were thought out well enough, but I didn't think it dived too deep on this since, like I said earlier, it's a love story at its core, which is fine. It's a good story. The final story is by Boston resident Joseph Sadari, and it's called A Girl and Her Dragon, A Life in 4 Parts. This story starts off establishing that dragons are real and have been around for a long time. Now, the Bronx Zoo has gotten a blue dragon, and one little girl named Stephanie Burnham is really excited about it. She begins a long-term interest in the blue dragon named Aslan, who everybody calls Ash. This story is an interesting look at the cruelty, unintended or not, perpetrated on zoo animals. Ash is caged and treated worse than a prison inmate at times. He has a small enclosure and he never gets to spread his wings. Uninformed people that probably never even go to the zoo are afraid of him getting loose and running or flying amok. Stephanie has a long-term interest in the welfare of Ash and constantly calls on the zoo board to stop treating him the way they do. I'm rating this one an 8 out of 10. There are two main reasons for that. The first is that I don't really like zoos, and I think that unendangered animals should be free to live their lives, so I agree with Stephanie in the story. The second reason is that the story is written as a series of lists, text messages, emails, and newspaper articles. In other words, it's an epistolary story, which I always find kind of interesting. It's great to see authors play with that. I found this approach highly entertaining for the story, and it made the story a really easy read and a really fast read, even though it's a pretty long story. The final part of the book is the year in the contests. This section starts off with a short bit about the growth of the Writers of the Future contest over the years. Next, it lists off some of the awards and accomplishments of previous winners. After that, it lists the placement of the various stories in their quarters. The number one story in the 4 quarters were Shell Game for Q1, Form 14B, Application for Certification of Consciousness Transfer Postmortem for Q2, In Living Color for Q3, and A Ready-Made Bubble of Light for Q4. These are the 4 stories that get to compete for the grand prize at the awards ceremony. Personally, I would order these from strongest to least strong in this order. In Living Color is the strongest, followed by Shell Game, and then Form 14B, and then finally A Ready-Made Bubble of Light. And there you have it, another strong anthology from the Writers of the Future contest. If you get a chance, pick this up when it's released on April 28th. Feel free to leave thoughts or comments on this video below. I'll do another video later that covers the art and how they relate to each story, and I'll release that after the awards ceremony so that I don't ruin the surprise for the authors that are seeing their story art for the first time in a few weeks. That's it for me, and go get this book. It's pretty good. Bye for now.